Life has a way of teaching the most unexpected lessons, and on a sunny spring afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia, those lessons were about to unfold in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where million-dollar homes stood proudly behind perfectly manicured lawns. Officer James Miller was having what he considered a routine day. He'd been patrolling these streets for nearly 8 years, and he prided himself on knowing every face, every car, and every detail that seemed out of place. The neighborhood residents knew him well. He was the officer who always wore his badge with an air of authority that sometimes bordered on arrogance. As Miller cruised down Maple Avenue in his patrol car, the afternoon sun glinting off the hood, he noticed something that caught his attention. A young black teenager, probably around 14, was riding what appeared to be a brand new mountain bike. The bike wasn't just any regular bicycle, it was a high-end model that Miller recognized as costing well over $1,000. The boy was wearing neat, casual clothes, a blue polo shirt, khaki shorts, and clean sneakers. He was riding carefully, following all the traffic rules, even signaling his turns. Nothing about his behavior suggested any wrongdoing. Yet something in Miller's mind clicked. That familiar, unconscious bias he'd never admitted to having started whispering its toxic thoughts. The teenager was pedaling at a leisurely pace, enjoying the spring breeze, completely unaware of the drama about to unfold. He'd just finished his homework and was taking advantage of the beautiful weather to test out his birthday present, a bike he'd been dreaming about for months. Miller slowed his patrol car, following the boy at a distance. He watched as the teenager waved friendly hellos to some of the neighbors working in their gardens. Several of them waved back with warm smiles, but Miller didn't notice these natural interactions. His focus had narrowed, and his assumptions had already begun to form a story in his head. The officer's hand moved to his radio, but he hesitated. There hadn't been any reports of stolen bikes in the area. No complaints about suspicious teenagers, no actual reason for concern. Yet, Miller couldn't shake off his unfounded suspicion. The more he watched the boy riding peacefully through the neighborhood, the more convinced he became that something wasn't right. As the teenager turned onto Oak Street, Miller finally made his decision. He flipped on his patrol car's lights, not the siren, but enough to make his presence known. The boy noticed the flashing lights in his peripheral vision and slowly came to a stop, carefully putting one foot on the ground while still straddling his bike. The look on the boy's face wasn't one of guilt or fear. It was confusion mixed with a hint of resignation, an expression that suggested he'd perhaps experienced similar situations before. He remained calm and composed, qualities that would have impressed most people but somehow only served to heighten Miller's suspicion. Miller parked his patrol car at an angle, creating an imposing presence on the quiet street. As he stepped out of his vehicle, he adjusted his belt and straightened his posture, adopting the stern expression he'd perfected over his years on the force. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as he approached the teenager, his hand resting casually near his hip. Several neighbors had begun to take notice of the scene unfolding on their street. Some slowed their gardening activities, while others paused their afternoon walks. There was something about the situation that felt wrong to them, a familiar tension in the air that shouldn't exist in their peaceful neighborhood. The teenager straightened up, maintaining a respectful posture despite the uncertainty of the situation. He'd been taught well by his parents about how to handle encounters with law enforcement: stay calm, be polite, keep your hands visible. Little did Officer Miller know that this boy's father had spent years preparing him for moments exactly like this, though hoping they would never come. As Miller approached, his boots crunching on the sun-baked asphalt, he had no idea that his next actions would not only change his life, but would spark a conversation that would ripple through the entire community. He was about to learn a lesson about assumptions, privilege, and power, one that would force him to confront his own biases in ways he never expected. The stage was set for a confrontation that would soon make headlines, but not for the reasons Officer Miller might have imagined. The quiet neighborhood was about to become the backdrop for a story that would challenge perspectives and push for change in ways that would impact far more than just this one afternoon encounter. This was just the beginning of a situation that would unfold in ways none of the participants could have predicted, on a day that started like any other, but would end up being anything but ordinary. The tension in the air grew thick as Officer Miller closed the distance between himself and the young teenager. The boy remained perfectly still on his bike, hands visible on the handlebars, just as his parents had taught him. The afternoon sun beat down on them, both as neighbors watched the scene unfold from behind their curtains and garden hedges. "Where'd you get that bike?" Miller's voice came out sharp and accusatory, skipping any pretense of a proper greeting. His hand remained near his belt as he circled the teenager, examining the expensive mountain bike with exaggerated scrutiny. The boy's voice was steady despite his racing heart. "It's my birthday present, sir. I just got it last week." He reached slowly toward his pocket. "I have the receipt and registration at home if you'd like to see them." "Don't move," Miller barked, causing the boy to freeze mid-motion. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The officer's reaction was completely disproportionate to the calm, composed behavior of the teenager. By now, more neighbors had gathered on their porches and lawns. An elderly couple walking their dogs stopped in their tracks, the husband gripping his wife's hand tightly. A woman watering her flowers set down her hose, pulled out her phone, and began recording discreetly from behind her rose bushes. "This is a very expensive bike," Miller continued, his tone dripping with disbelief. "And this is a very nice neighborhood. You'll understand why I find it unusual to see someone like you riding it here." The boy took a deep breath, just like his father had taught him. "I live here, sir, in the blue house on the corner of Pine Street." He kept his voice respectful but firm, fighting against the humiliation burning in his chest. Miller scoffed. "That's Judge Thompson's house." He moved closer, towering over the teenager. "You expect me to believe you live there?" "Yes, sir, I do." The boy's voice didn't waver. "Judge Thompson is my father." The officer's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Right, and I'm the President of the United States." He reached for the bike's handlebars. "Step off the bike. We're going to sort this out at the station." More phones had appeared in windows and doorways, recording the escalating situation. The neighborhood that usually buzzed with the gentle sounds of sprinklers and birdsong now crackled with tension and whispered conversations. "Officer," a voice called out from across the street. A woman in gardening clothes had stepped forward, phone raised high. "I've been recording this entire interaction. The young man is telling the truth. He does live here. We're neighbors." Miller's head snapped toward the voice, but his grip on the bike didn't loosen. "Ma'am, this is police business. Please step back." The boy remained remarkably composed, though his hands had started to tremble slightly on the handlebars. He'd heard stories about moments like this from his friends, from his father's colleagues, from the news, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The weight of the injustice pressed heavily on his young shoulders. "If you could just let me call my father," the boy suggested calmly. "He can clear this up in minutes." "Oh, we'll be making some calls all right," Miller replied, pulling out his radio. "But first, you're going to step away from this bike, and we're going to have a serious conversation about theft in this neighborhood." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their murmurs of disapproval becoming more audible. Several phones were pointed at the scene, capturing every word, every gesture, every moment of this increasingly tense situation. The boy's hands gripped the handlebars tighter, not in defiance, but in an attempt to steady himself. He'd done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood, on his own street, in front of his neighbors. Just as Miller began to reach for his handcuffs, a sleek black SUV turned onto the street. The boy's expression shifted slightly, a subtle mix of relief and vindication crossing his face. Officer Miller, focused on removing the teenager from the bike, hadn't noticed the approaching vehicle. The SUV's tires crunched to a stop on the sun-warmed asphalt, and the driver's door opened. The next few moments would transform this from a story of prejudice and power to one that would shake the entire police department to its core. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as footsteps approached from behind Officer Miller. The woman with the phone was still recording, capturing what would soon become a viral moment of reckoning, one that would force not just Officer Miller, but an entire community to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, authority, and justice. The confrontation had reached its tipping point, and the next few minutes would change everyone involved in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The quiet neighborhood street had become center stage for a drama that would soon make headlines across the city, sparking conversations that were long overdue. The woman with her phone held high wasn't just any neighbor. She was a retired civil rights attorney who had spent decades fighting against exactly this type of injustice. She had been tending to her prized rose garden when she first noticed the patrol car's lights flashing, and something in her gut told her this wasn't a routine stop. "I want everyone to know I'm recording this interaction," she announced clearly, her voice carrying across the quiet street. She took a few steps closer, making sure to maintain a safe distance while keeping her camera steady. Years of courtroom experience had taught her the importance of documenting everything. Other neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. A retired teacher who lived next door joined the attorney, phone also raised. "I've known this young man since he was in diapers," she called out, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. "He helps me with my groceries every weekend." Officer Miller's posture stiffened as he realized just how many witnesses were gathering. His hand still rested near his belt, but uncertainty had begun to creep into his expression. The boy remained calm on his bike, though his knuckles were white from gripping the handlebars. A jogger who had been passing by slowed to a stop, pulling out his earbuds. He was a local news reporter, and his professional instincts kicked in immediately. He too began recording, knowing that what he was witnessing might be more than just a neighborhood incident. "Officer," the attorney spoke again, her voice clear and measured, "I'm going to narrate exactly what I'm seeing for the record. You've stopped a young resident of this neighborhood who is riding his own bicycle, which he received as a birthday present. He has offered to prove ownership, and you've responded with threats and intimidation." The crowd had grown to about 15 people now, forming a loose semicircle around the scene. Their phones created a wall of digital witnesses, each device capturing the officer's increasing discomfort. A young couple pushing a stroller paused at the corner. The husband, a tech company executive, quickly accessed his neighborhood security app. "I've got footage from our street cameras showing this young man riding the same bike every day for the past week," he announced loudly. "I'm sending it to the police department right now." The attorney took another step forward, her professional training evident in every word. "Officer Miller, yes, I can see your name tag clearly. Would you care to explain why you felt it necessary to stop this young man? What probable cause did you have?" Miller's face flushed red as he struggled to maintain his authority in the face of mounting community resistance. "This is a police matter," he repeated, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. The boy, still holding his position on the bike, spoke up quietly but clearly. "My father always tells me that justice works best in the light. That's why he keeps his courtroom open to the public." A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sounds of more approaching footsteps. The attorney's camera caught the exact moment when Officer Miller's expression changed, the supple shift from authority to dawning realization that he had made a terrible mistake. The gathered neighbors moved closer together, forming an impromptu community shield around one of their own. They weren't just witnesses anymore, they had become active participants in a moment that would soon transform their community. The retired teacher stepped forward again. "I taught civics for 30 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "I taught my students about their rights, about justice, about the importance of standing up when they see something wrong. Today, we're not just watching, we're standing up." The woman with her phone held high wasn't just any neighbor, she was a retired civil rights attorney who had spent decades fighting against exactly this type of injustice. She had been tending to her prized rose garden when she first noticed the patrol car's lights flashing, and something in her gut told her this wasn't a routine stop. "I want everyone to know I'm recording this interaction," she announced clearly, her voice carrying across the quiet street. She took a few steps closer, making sure to maintain a safe distance while keeping her camera steady. Years of courtroom experience had taught her the importance of documenting everything. Other neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. A retired teacher who lived next door joined the attorney, phone also raised. "I've known this young man since he was in diapers," she called out, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. "He helps me with my groceries every weekend." Officer Miller's posture stiffened as he realized just how many witnesses were gathering. His hand still rested near his belt, but uncertainty had begun to creep into his expression. The boy remained calm on his bike, though his knuckles were white from gripping the handlebars. A jogger who had been passing by slowed to a stop, pulling out his earbuds. He was a local news reporter, and his professional instincts kicked in immediately. He too began recording, knowing that what he was witnessing might be more than just a neighborhood incident. "Officer," the attorney spoke again, her voice clear and measured, "I'm going to narrate exactly what I'm seeing for the record. You've stopped a young resident of this neighborhood who is riding his own bicycle, which he received as a birthday present. He has offered to prove ownership, and you've responded with threats and intimidation." The crowd had grown to about 15 people now, forming a loose semicircle around the scene. Their phones created a wall of digital witnesses, each device capturing the officer's increasing discomfort. A young couple pushing a stroller paused at the corner. The husband, a tech company executive, quickly accessed his neighborhood security app. "I've got footage from our street cameras showing this young man riding the same bike every day for the past week," he announced loudly. "I'm sending it to the police department right now." The attorney took another step forward, her professional training evident in every word. "Officer Miller, yes, I can see your name tag clearly. Would you care to explain why you felt it necessary to stop this young man? What probable cause did you have?" Miller's face flushed red as he struggled to maintain his authority in the face of mounting community resistance. "This is a police matter," he repeated, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. The boy, still holding his position on the bike, spoke up quietly but clearly. "My father always tells me that justice works best in the light. That's why he keeps his courtroom open to the public." A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the sounds of more approaching footsteps. The attorney's camera caught the exact moment when Officer Miller's expression changed, the supple shift from authority to dawning realization that he had made a terrible mistake. The gathered neighbors moved closer together, forming an impromptu community shield around one of their own. They weren't just witnesses anymore, they had become active participants in a moment that would soon transform their community. The retired teacher stepped forward again. "I taught civics for 30 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "I taught my students about their rights, about justice, about the importance of standing up when they see something wrong. Today, we're not just watching, we're standing up." From down the street came the sound of another vehicle approaching. The crowd's attention shifted slightly, but their phones remained focused on Officer Miller and the young man. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, creating a dramatic backdrop for what was about to unfold. The attorney, still recording steadily, began to walk slowly around the scene, capturing every angle. "For the record," she continued, "I count at least 12 witnesses, all residents of this neighborhood, all recording this incident. We can all confirm that this young man has done nothing wrong or suspicious." The tension in the air was palpable as the sound of car doors opening and closing echoed through the quiet street. Officer Miller's hand had finally dropped from his belt, and his earlier confidence had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like concern. The young man on the bike remained composed, but a small smile had begun to form at the corners of his mouth. He knew what was coming next. The neighbors, their phones still recording, watched as footsteps approached from behind Officer Miller, footsteps that would change the entire dynamic of this confrontation. The attorney's camera captured it all: the community's solidarity, the officer's growing discomfort, and the approaching figure that would turn this incident into a powerful lesson about assumptions, privilege, and the importance of community standing together against injustice. The scene was set for a moment of reckoning that would soon make headlines across the city, but more importantly, it would become a catalyst for real change in how law enforcement interacted with the community they were sworn to protect and serve. The black SUV's door opened with a quiet click that somehow seemed to echo through the tense afternoon air. Judge Thompson stepped out, his tall frame unfolding from the vehicle with the deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades commanding courtroom attention. He wore a crisp navy suit, having just left the federal courthouse downtown, and his presence immediately changed the atmosphere on the quiet suburban street. Officer Miller's back was still turned to the SUV, his attention fixed on the boy and the growing crowd of neighbors. He hadn't yet noticed the imposing figure approaching from behind, stepping carefully across the sun-warmed pavement. "Officer," the judge's deep voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd, "I believe you've been questioning my son." The effect was immediate. Officer Miller's shoulders stiffened and he turned slowly, his face draining of color as recognition set in. Everyone in the Atlanta legal system knew Judge Thompson. His reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for injustice. The boy on the bike smiled slightly but remained where he was, watching as his father approached. The neighbors' phones captured every moment as the judge closed the distance between himself and the officer, his footsteps measured and purposeful. "Your Honor," Miller stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. I was just. The judge raised his hand slightly, a gesture familiar to anyone who had ever been in his courtroom. It was a simple movement that commanded immediate silence. "I heard most of what happened from my clerk, who lives 3 doors down. She called me as soon as she saw you stop my son." The crowd had grown quieter, hanging on every word. The retired attorney was still recording, her steady hand capturing what was quickly becoming a powerful moment of accountability. "My son," the judge continued, his voice remaining remarkably calm, "was riding the bicycle I gave him for his birthday last week. The same bicycle he rides every day in this neighborhood, where we have lived for the past 12 years. He paused, letting each word sink in. "Would you care to explain your probable cause for stopping him?" Officer Miller shifted his weight uncomfortably. The body camera on his uniform was recording everything, and he knew it. "Sir, I was just doing my routine patrol, and I noticed." "You noticed a young black teenager riding an expensive bike in an upscale neighborhood," the judge finished for him. "And you made assumptions. The same kind of assumptions I've spent my entire career fighting against in our justice system." The gathered neighbors nodded in agreement. The retired teacher wiped a tear from her eye, while the jogger reporter typed rapidly on his phone, likely already composing his story. The judge took another step forward, his presence both commanding and controlled. "Officer Miller, I could file a formal complaint. I could call your supervisor, whom I know quite well. I could make this incident very uncomfortable for you and the department." Miller's face had taken on a distinctly ashen hue. The afternoon sun seemed to beat down even more intensely as he waited for the judge to continue. "But that's not how we create lasting change," the judge said, his voice softening slightly. "My son and I have discussed moments like this, moments that unfortunately many young black men in America still face. We've talked about how to respond with dignity, with composure, and with the hope that each interaction might lead to better understanding." The boy straightened on his bike, pride evident in his posture as his father spoke. The neighbors had grown completely silent, their phones still recording what had transformed from a confrontation into a masterclass in handling injustice. "So instead," the judge continued, reaching into his suit jacket, "I'm going to give you my card. Tomorrow morning, I'd like you to come to my chambers. We're going to have a conversation about community policing, about implicit bias, and about how we can work together to make sure no other child has to experience what my son experienced today." The officer accepted the card with a trembling hand, his earlier authority replaced by genuine remorse. "Yes, Your Honor. I apologize. To your son, to you, to everyone here." The judge nodded, then turned to the gathered neighbors. "Thank you all for standing up, for bearing witness, for protecting one of our own. This is what community looks like." The retired attorney lowered her phone finally, a smile of satisfaction on her face. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the street as the crowd began to disperse, knowing they had just witnessed something powerful. A moment when justice was served not through force or confrontation, but through wisdom and the promise of change. Ritchie. The morning after the incident, the local news station's morning broadcast led with shaky phone footage of the confrontation. The retired attorney's clear, steady recording had made its way to every major news outlet in Atlanta. By breakfast time, social media was buzzing with discussions about racial profiling and community policing. Judge Thompson sat in his chambers, sipping his morning coffee and reviewing the flood of emails and messages that had poured in overnight. His son's experience had struck a chord with people across the city, but the judge was determined to turn this incident into something more than just another viral video. The courthouse security guard knocked softly on the door. "Officer Miller is here for your meeting, Your Honor." The judge took a deep breath, straightened his robes, and called out, "Send him in." Officer Miller entered, looking like he hadn't slept much. Gone was the swagger from yesterday. In its place was a man who seemed to have spent the night wrestling with some hard truths. He carried his cap in his hands, turning it nervously. Please, sit down, the judge gestured to the chair across from his desk. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the wall of law books behind him. I appreciate you coming in. The local newspaper had already run a front-page story about the incident. The headline read, "Community Stands Together. Police Stop Reveals Deeper Issues." Several photos showed neighbors with their phones raised, standing in solidarity with the young teenager. "Your Honor, I want to apologize again," Miller began, his voice heavy with regret. "I've been up all night thinking about what happened, about the assumptions I made." The judge held up his hand. "Officer Miller, this meeting isn't about making you feel worse. It's about making things better." He pulled out a folder from his desk. "I've been working on a proposal for the police department for several months now. Yesterday's incident just confirmed its urgency." Outside the chamber windows, the city was fully awake. Traffic moved steadily below, and people hurried along the sidewalks, unaware of the important conversation taking place above them. "The police chief called me this morning," the judge continued. "She's as concerned as I am about what happened. But more importantly, she's open to making real changes." Miller leaned forward slightly, his attention focused on the judge's words. "We're establishing a new community oversight committee," the judge explained. "It will bring together police officers, community leaders, and residents to review policies and build better relationships. And I want you to be part of it." Miller's eyes widened in surprise. "Me? But after what happened?" "Precisely because of what happened," the judge interrupted. "You made a mistake, yes. But how you handle that mistake, that's what matters now." The morning news continued to buzz with updates. Local radio stations were fielding calls from residents sharing similar experiences. The incident had opened up a citywide conversation that was long overdue. Back in the neighborhood, the retired attorney was organizing a community meeting. The young reporter who had witnessed everything was working on an in-depth piece about police-community relations. The retired teacher had already reached out to her former colleagues about incorporating discussions of civil rights and community activism into their lessons. The judge's son had gone to school that morning, carrying not just his backpack, but also the weight of unexpected publicity. His classmates had seen the videos, and his teachers had used the incident as a starting point for important discussions about society and justice. "The committee will meet twice a month," the judge explained to Miller. "We'll review incidents, discuss training programs, and work on building trust between law enforcement and the community. It's not about pointing fingers, it's about finding solutions." Local civil rights organizations had already reached out, offering support and resources. The police department's public affairs office was drafting a statement about new training initiatives and community engagement programs. "Your Honor," Miller spoke carefully, "I want to do better. I need to do better. Yesterday opened my eyes to things I hadn't wanted to see before." The judge nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's exactly why you're the right person for this committee. You've experienced firsthand how unconscious bias can affect judgment, and now you're willing to learn and change." By lunchtime, the story had reached national news outlets. Commentators were discussing the broader implications of what had happened in that quiet Atlanta neighborhood. But unlike many similar incidents, this one carried a message of hope, a community coming together, leadership taking positive action, and the possibility of real change. The judge extended his hand across the desk. "So, Officer Miller, are you ready to be part of the solution?" Miller stood and shook the judge's hand firmly. "Yes, Your Honor, I am." As they discussed the details of the new initiative, the morning sun continued to rise over Atlanta, shining light on a city that was beginning to have the difficult but necessary conversations about justice, equality, and community. What had started as a moment of confrontation was transforming into an opportunity for genuine progress. Outside the courthouse, life went on as usual, but something had shifted in the city's consciousness. A single incident, captured on dozens of phones, had become a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments. 3 months after the incident, the local community center buzzed with activity. The newly formed Police Community Relations Committee was holding its 6th meeting, and the room was packed. Officer Miller sat at the front table, alongside the judge and other community leaders, his uniform crisp, but his demeanor notably different from that fateful day. The changes had started small but were growing steadily. Every police officer in the district was now required to attend monthly community engagement sessions. These weren't just formal meetings, they included shared meals, sports events with local youth, and open discussions about concerns on both sides. When I first joined this committee, Officer Miller addressed the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "I thought I was here because I made a mistake, but I've learned it's about much more than that. It's about understanding each other." The judge's son sat in the audience, surrounded by his friends. He had become something of a local leader among his peers, helping to organize youth events that brought together teenagers and police officers in positive settings. The bike that had sparked the initial confrontation had become a symbol of change. He now led weekly community bike rides where officers and local kids cycled together through neighborhood streets. The retired attorney, who had recorded the original incident, now headed the legal advisory team for the committee. She worked closely with both police officers and community members, helping to bridge gaps in understanding and creating guidelines for better interactions. "We've seen a 40% decrease in complaints about officer conduct," the police chief announced, pointing to a graph on the presentation screen. "But more importantly, we've seen a 60% increase in positive community interactions reported by both officers and residents." The local news crew that had covered the initial incident was back, but this time they were documenting success stories. Their cameras captured officers playing basketball with local kids, joining neighborhood cookouts, and participating in community service projects. "The real change," the judge explained to the gathered crowd, "hasn't just been in policies or procedures. It's been in attitudes and understanding. We're learning to see each other as people first." Officer Miller had become an unexpected champion for change within the police department. He shared his story during training sessions, not shying away from acknowledging his previous biases, but focusing on the transformation that followed. The community center's walls were now decorated with photos from various events, officers helping elderly residents with yard work, police youth mentoring programs, and community festivals where badges and uniforms mixed freely with civilian clothes. 6 months ago, a young officer spoke up from the audience. "I might have made the same mistake Officer Miller did, but now, thanks to this program, I approach every interaction differently. I ask myself different questions. I make different assumptions, or better yet, try not to make assumptions at all." The retired teacher, who had witnessed the original incident, now conducted workshops for both officers and students about communication and mutual respect. Her sessions always started with a simple question: "What do you see when you look at me, and what do you want me to see when I look at you?" The judge's son stood up to share his perspective. "What happened to me wasn't unique," he said, his voice clear and confident. "But how our community responded to it, that was special. We didn't let anger win. We chose to build something better." The committee had created new protocols for police stops, emphasizing communication and de-escalation. But more than that, they had created opportunities for regular, positive interactions between police and residents before any incidents could occur. "We're not perfect yet," Officer Miller admitted to the room. "We still have work to do. But we're learning, we're growing, and most importantly, we're doing it together." The meeting concluded with plans for the upcoming community festival, where police officers would serve as grill masters at the neighborhood barbecue. The image of Officer Miller flipping burgers while chatting with residents would have seemed impossible just months ago. As people filed out of the community center, there was a sense of real progress in the air. Children high-fived officers as they passed. Elderly residents chatted comfortably with patrol officers about neighborhood concerns, and teenagers discussed plans for the next community bike ride. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the community center parking lot. But unlike the shadows of that incident months ago, these shadows held promise rather than tension. They represented not an ending, but a continuing journey toward understanding and respect. The local news crew packed up their equipment, having captured not just another meeting, but evidence of a community that had chosen to turn a moment of conflict into an opportunity for lasting change. Their story would show that sometimes the most powerful responses to injustice come not through confrontation, but through connection. 1 year had passed since that pivotal afternoon when a routine bike ride turned into a catalyst for change. The annual community festival was in full swing at the local park, with the autumn sun warming the gathered crowds. Officer Miller, now promoted to Community Relations Sergeant, stood behind the grill, expertly flipping burgers while chatting with residents. The judge's son, now a sophomore in high school, led a group of younger kids on a bike safety demonstration. The bikes gleamed in the sunlight as he showed them proper hand signals and safety rules. His own bike, the one that had sparked everything, was now decorated with a small badge, a symbol of the bridge built between the police and community. Who would have thought, the retired attorney mused to a group of neighbors, that one difficult moment could lead to all this? She gestured around the park, where officers and residents mingled freely, sharing food and stories. The changes had spread far beyond their neighborhood. Police departments from other cities had sent representatives to study their community policing model. The judge had been invited to speak at law enforcement conferences across the country, sharing how one community turned confrontation into collaboration. Officer Miller approached the podium set up near the park center. The crowd quieted as he began to speak, his voice carrying across the grass where families sat on blankets and lawn chairs. "A year ago, I made a mistake that could have ended my career," he began, his honesty drawing the audience in. "Instead, it became the beginning of something remarkable. We've learned that real change doesn't come from pointing fingers or assigning blame. It comes from reaching out, listening, and being willing to grow." The statistics backed up his words. Complaints against officers had dropped to their lowest level in department history. More importantly, voluntary community interactions had soared. Officers were now regular guests at school career days, neighborhood watch meetings, and local sports events. The judge's son stepped forward to share the microphone. "Last year, I was just a kid on a bike who got stopped by an officer. Today, I'm part of a program that teaches both kids and police officers how to see each other as people first." Their story had inspired changes in police training programs across the state. New officers now spent their first month doing community service alongside residents, building relationships before they ever put on a badge. Veteran officers participated in regular community feedback sessions, where honest discussions about bias and perception led to better understanding. The retired teacher, who had witnessed the original incident, now coordinated a mentorship program matching officers with local students. "We're not just changing policies," she explained to a visiting reporter. "We're changing hearts and minds, one conversation at a time." The community bike rides had become a monthly tradition, with hundreds of participants. Officers and residents pedaled side by side, the simple act of sharing the road becoming a powerful symbol of unity and understanding. As the festival continued, children played at a bounce house supervised by smiling officers, teenagers showed elderly residents how to use social media at a tech booth, and families shared meals with the men and women who protected their streets. The local news crew that had covered the original incident was back for an anniversary story. Their cameras captured Officer Miller and the judge's son demonstrating a new police training scenario they had developed together, teaching officers how to approach youth with respect and understanding. "The real success," the judge told the gathered crowd, "isn't in the programs we've created or the policies we've changed. It's in the relationships we've built. It's in the trust we've established. It's in knowing that when challenges arise, and they will, we'll face them together." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festival, families lingered, reluctant to let the day end. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, punctuated by the happy shrieks of children playing with their new police officer friends. Officer Miller stood with the judge and his son, watching the scene before them. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth." The judge nodded, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "And sometimes," he added, "the most powerful change comes not from confrontation, but from the willingness to learn and grow together." As darkness fell, the festival lights twinkled on, illuminating a community that had learned valuable lessons about justice, understanding, and the power of coming together. The story that began with a stopped bike had transformed into something much bigger, a blueprint for how communities across the country could work together to build bridges of understanding and respect. The festival ended with a candlelight ceremony where officers and residents stood side by side, their lights joined together to illuminate the night. A living symbol of how darkness can be transformed into light when people choose to work together for change.